Hello and welcome back to the Meerkat Musings YouTube channel, hosted by me, Ben, aka Daft Moan. Who else would it be, of course? Coming at you from a cold Thursday morning, as to be expected really with March. As I mentioned in my video the other day, we're not really into warmer conditions just yet. We're not in horrible cold conditions, of course. I'd like to think that perhaps the worst of the wintry weather has begun to move away, but I am yearning for warmer times still, and I'm afraid I'll probably moan about this until we get warmer times, at which point I'll moan that it's too hot, because I'm British, and that's what we do when it comes to the weather. We moan about it pretty much non-stop in any and every conceivable way. But that is not the purpose of this video. If I did a video about the weather and made this into a series, it would be a daily thing, almost an hourly thing. So we'll avoid that at all costs. No, instead, I am going to chat a little bit about a couple of prompts that I did over on Meerkat Musings a short time ago, where I was thinking about a couple of things. I was thinking about a paperless society and a cashless society. If we begin with the idea of a paperless society, what you probably already know is this is where businesses and companies have less physical paperwork to handle and more stuff is dealt with electronically. So when you send documents, you don't send them by post, you send them by email, for example. And in terms of document storage, you don't necessarily print things off and file them away somewhere. They're stored electronically on a database somewhere. Now, I have heard this notion of a paperless society more times than I can count, but it is almost inevitable that as soon as someone says this, more paperwork actually appears to be generated. And it seems that for all of our electronic wizardry, we now have the means to scan and email documents straight from our phones, among other things. It seems that we always fall back on the comfort, perhaps, of a physical document in our hands. We could take this to one extreme and say, if you look at paperless society, look at the influence of e-readers, for example. But we haven't done away with physical books because too many people like physical books. I like physical books. I have an e-reader and I do use it, and I think it's a very, very handy thing to have. But I also like to have a physical book in my hand from time to time. And I don't think we're going to do away with paper in that sense anytime soon. I think we send out birthday cards and things to people because people like to have a physical card as opposed to an e-card, for example. But focusing more on what this tends to mean, we look at businesses and companies, you might be thinking, why is it that so many of them continue to fall back upon paper documents? These documents are sometimes time-consuming to print. They need to be stored, and then, after a certain amount of time, due to data protection laws, they need to be disposed of. All of that's time-consuming, and all of that can be quite costly as well. And there's an environmental factor to consider as well, because this process of producing paper documents and also the means to store them is potentially damaging to the environment. It certainly doesn't do anything to lower a company's carbon footprint. So why is it then, as I say, that companies fall back upon paper? Well, as someone who works for a company, it's I guess it's a little bit of a fallback means in case, for whatever reason, the documents on the computer are corrupted or lost, which can happen. And it's also, let's say, for example, I'm printing out a quote for a customer. It's a lot easier to print off a quote and give it to them, for them to physically have in their hands and study, than it is for them to look at that on a computer screen. So it's smoother and easier from that point of view. being able to print off that same document myself, I actually find it easier if I'm checking an order, for example, to check it as a physical copy than as lines of text on a screen. And I suspect quite a few people would feel the same way. In terms of having documents signed, well, it's not impossible in this day and age to sign it via, an e-signature, but it's arguably still more straightforward to have a physical copy of something for someone to sign. So we tend to see quite a lot of that. Certainly where I work, we kind of require having that done. We require having T's and C's and things sort of signed off and dealt with that way. So as much as it might sometimes be awkward and uncomfortable to have wads of files sitting around, sometimes it's just not possible to do away with it. Companies that deliver stuff to us, they have physical documents they want signed, although some companies actually do sign off with electronic signatures now. But it seems like in many, many regards, physical documents are going to stay with us for a fair time to come. I've been hearing the idea of a paperless society pretty much since I started work over 24 years ago almost this year. So in that time, I have seen more and more paperwork. So I don't think that we're going to move away from physical documentation anytime soon. Maybe we should try harder at that because, as I say, there is an environmental element to this. There's a carbon footprint element to this that can be quite serious in some respects. But it ain't happening. It ain't happening anytime soon. Not within, I don't figure it's going to happen within my lifetime, to be honest. And I could be wrong, but I doubt it. I think I could live to be 90 and still be pushing paperwork across a desk because that's simply the nature of the world we live in. So, I suspect that physical documentation is going to stay with us for a while to come. And in some respects, as I say, it's actually preferred. Like, for example, books, which I think always, generally speaking, prefer to physically hold in my hand. So we have the notion of a paperless society. We also have another notion which has perhaps taken hold more, which is the idea of a cashless society. Once upon a time, everything was done by cash, of course. There was no such thing as credit cards until relatively recently. But then the rise of bank cards and credit cards and debit cards and all that jazz began to sort of transform how we do business transactions. And then we had the rise of contactless technology, and that was then incorporated into a lot of mobile devices and is even now incorporated into smartwatches. So now, if you have a smartwatch, which I don't, but I know people who do, you can literally go up to, something and say, you can go into Greg's, for example, and when you're ready to pay, you tap your watch against the reader and boom, done instantly. Very, very easy. Now, for a lot of businesses, at one point, card transactions and that kind of thing would incur transaction fees that made it less desirable than handling cash. But this has flipped around, and nowadays cash is actually, I can't speak for every company, but certainly for our work, cash is less preferred. Cash, you've got to faff around counting it and verifying it, and then you've got to get it to the bank, all of which takes extra time. It has to be transported, which has to be done securely, and that incurs a cost to everyone. And there is more chance of an error with cash. You could count it and count it and count it, but if a couple of notes are stuck together, you're going to miscount it every time. There's going to be issues with the banking. It causes more of a palaver. Whereas, if you're handling a transaction for, say, £10, cash isn't too bad. If you're handling a transaction for £2,500, you don't want to be messing around. And in particular with us, the way our payment structure works, it's never a precise amount. We have, because of the discount structure, weird figures. So, for example, instead of, say, £2,500, the figure might be 2496 and 21p or something like that. And we don't have change, we don't have a till, so it becomes even more faffy for us because it means we have to round things. Well, you can't round things up when dealing with that kind of transaction for a customer. You have to try and round them down usually. So that whole palaver becomes even more of a mess. So it's much easier and cleaner for us to do a card transaction. And for a lot of people, well, certainly for myself, I find it easier when I'm off, in town and I nip into, Greg's or Starbucks or wherever to use my phone to pay these days. I don't even have to get my bank card out of my wallet. I can just literally tap my phone and use that to buy my coffee or whatever. It's quick and it's easy and it's done. And the same thing applies to other things. Bus tickets. Bus tickets are now handled almost entirely through an app now that our bus company has launched, which is not to say that you have to use it, because you don't have to. You can tap your card on the reader and buy a ticket in that kind of sense. But that's also leading me to the drawback of having no cash, because there are plenty of people out there, particularly perhaps of older generations, although not exclusive to older generations, who are not comfortable using contactless cards and technology. And they would much rather hand the bus driver the coins for their ticket. This is still doable, but it's an increasing headache for the bus drivers because their floats are of limited, shall we say, value. And it's often a case of you have to have exact change because they don't have the facilities on buses these days to give you change. So it's a bit jarring in some respects sometimes in those circumstances for people. We have customers who will insist upon paying cash. That's also sometimes I'm not going to say tax evasion method because it's not tax evasion, but it's about maybe trying to get around like kind of VAT stuff and that kind of thing. So some people prefer to pay cash for that reason. And we can't refuse cash. We wouldn't want to refuse business. So we have to kind of bite that bullet, so to speak. So I think, as with paper, I don't think that physical cash money is going away. And in particular, in the more rural areas, you're going to find more cash. Local shops, in particular, small businesses, will probably deal more with cash. You go into like a thrift shop or a charity shop, for example. More and more of them are geared up to do cards now, but in many regards, it's a lot easier and simpler for them to handle a small cash transaction. It's cheaper for them in that sense because there are still card fees. And this brings me to another interesting point, because some card fees for some types of bank card are more expensive than others, which is why my employers, for example, do not accept American Express, because the rates that American Express charge are prohibitive compared to the other companies. So we do not take American Express, and quite a few other companies, I think, are reluctant to take Amex because for reasons that only they know, well, I certainly don't know, they charge more. And I'm sure, that makes absolute sense to someone somewhere, but it makes absolutely no sense to me. So I don't think that we're going to shift away from cash completely at any point. Far-flung future, maybe. But again, within my lifetime, I think cash money is still going to be a physical thing. It's not going to go anywhere. it's too handy in some respects to have it available. But we shall see. We shall see. I mean, I think there might come a point, as I say, in the far future where everything is handled electronically, cash and documents. But I'm not expecting that within this meerkat's humble lifetime. It does make you kind of think, doesn't it, how something can become completely normal to one generation whilst feeling utterly alien to another generation. My beloved Nan would not have appreciated contactless technology. Whereas if you dropped me into an era of nothing but coins, I wouldn't be particularly comfortable with that. So, we kind of relentlessly move forward with technology and tools, and we don't always stop to consider how that impacts older generations. But there you go. There you are. That is where we're at. We are moving forward, well, arguably forward as a society, whether everyone likes it or not. Sooner or later, we're going to kiss goodbye to cash and goodbye to paper. And when that happens, there will be people who kind of push back against that a little bit. And they will resent that. But it is what it is. So we just have to knuckle down, I guess. For me, I prefer cards and contactless. I can work with cash, but given the choice, given the ease of use, I would rather hand over, I'd rather tap my bank card on a reader than hand over cash money. And I'm probably more comfortable with emailed documentation than I am physical copies, although I appreciate the importance of physical copies in some lines of work. But then for all of that, at the end, ironically enough, I'd rather hold a physical book in my hand than use an e-reader. So after all of that, I'm something of a walking contradiction. But then again, I've always been a bit of a walking contradiction. With that, I will leave you in peace and bid you adieu. And I'll try and figure out what I can ramble about next time around. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.